Hello, my name is Brittany Kavinsky, and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m., so we will begin our presentation shortly. Today, on Friday, August 12th, we will have our presentation on Fights Over Flight Addressing General Aviation Airports, given by Bradley Johnson. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we will be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here is a list of the sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible. As you can see, we have a few webcasts coming up in the next few months. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcast.htm and register for your webcast of choice. Follow us on Twitter @PlanningWebcast to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/cm. Select today's date, Friday, August 12th, and then select today's webcast, Fights Over Flight, Addressing General Aviation Airports. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available along with a 6-slide per page PDF of the presentation at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. At this time, I would like to introduce Bradley Johnson, who will be our speaker for today. Bradley Johnson is the Principal Planner and President of Ground Rules, Inc., a planning firm based in Indianapolis, Indiana, specializing in development regulations and community advancement. Since completing his private pilot training in 2000, he merged his talents in community planning and development regulations with aviation, and has been helping communities understand and protect general aviation airports since. Mr. Johnson holds 2 degrees in planning and has a career spanning 18 years with clients as far away as Australia and New Zealand. Brad was an editor and contributor to the books Indiana Planning Law Annotated 2009 and Estimating Planning Services, which became an APA award-winning publication. Mr. Johnson also volunteered and participated as a planning assistance team member for APA and AICP after Hurricane Katrina and Rita struck the Gulf Coast. Currently, Brad is the Professional Development Officer for the Indiana chapter of the American Planning Association.
Thank you, Brittany. Good day, everyone. Let's begin. In the first 4 sections of this presentation, I'm going to cover a lot of information about airports and what's at stake. Then I want to cover a couple other points about what we might do as planners and how we might regulate those airports for compatibility purposes. First thing I want to do, though, is to just define the types of airports that I want to speak about today. First of all, general aviation airport, you're going to hear that term quite a bit. General aviation is a subset of civilian airports, so basically anything that's non-military. It also is the type of airport that does not have scheduled air transport. So we're not talking about the major metropolitan airports. General aviation airports in the United States, you can see on this map, are plentiful. There's about 5,200 general aviation airports in the United States today. So when we talk about common fights, the name of this session, Fights Over Flight, a lot of things probably come to mind, and maybe some of you signed on and want to participate in this to learn a little bit about what you're experiencing, what you might do in your particular community. The one thing I want to point out again is that we're really not talking about the major metropolitan airports, so your frustrations with TSA and other frustrations we have when we go to the major airports really is not what we're wanting to talk about today. Rather, we want to speak about the conflicts between neighbors and airports. Whether it's a sleeping issue or noise issue or just somebody that may have owned their land for the last 200 years, it's been in their family for 200 years and they just don't want to sell it or have it impacted by the airport. Unfortunately, these get quite passionate. The neighbors are passionate about protecting their quality of life and their property values, and equally so, the airports are pretty stubborn and sometimes apathetic. We do find airports to also be empathetic, but sometimes they can be quite stubborn, and so that does become an issue. If you are in the Daytona Beach area anytime soon, you might see this billboard. I'm not sure if this boy is more concerned about the noise or the buzz cut he's about ready to get in this image, but it tells you a little bit about how, again, passionate people are about aircraft, noise, expansion of airports, and usually until there is an expansion of some sort or some kind of an announcement for increased aircraft operations, you don't usually get the outcry from the public. But this is one of those instances where the public's being quite vocal. Some other fights, and literally these are a few quotes that I personally have heard myself. Somebody that thought that the new IKEA store that's a possibility for their community is much better than the airport, and maybe that's really true if they did the cost-benefit analysis. But it's interesting to see how redevelopment officials look at airports as a lot of vacant ground, and sometimes in premium locations, and their minds start dreaming about what it might be. I'm hoping that this image on the far left is from a movie versus real world, but these are some of the images that people also, that maybe neighbors start to think of. They fear a plane coming down on their house, or they fear a plane coming down in the playground at the school that their kids go to. So there is sometimes fear-based concerns over airports. And lastly, the other common fight is between municipal leaders in airports. Municipal leaders not really appreciating what the airport is providing, and a lot of times you'll hear the rhetoric of, the airport's not making any money. And interestingly enough, I wasn't sure which quote to put with Homer, but I gave the airport in this case the upper hand, I guess, because airports are really not meant to make money as far as being cash flow positive, but they are meant to be critical infrastructure, just like parks and streets might be in a community. There are other conflicts that do arise as well. Takings claims sometimes comes up. Other things will come up. Certainly local flavor gets added to each of these airport disputes. Right now, though, I want to transition to, because we often get asked the question of, what is the value of our airport? Well, the main list of values are jobs, economic vitality. You can read the list there. One thing that's interesting, though, is that it's not always the jobs that are created locally by the airport, but maybe the jobs that are created in the region or even in the nation by an airport being in a community. Just as an example, here in Indiana, there's a Honda plant that was recently located in Greensburg. And Honda does not have, even though it's a major facility, it does not have a business model where they regularly use corporate aircraft. However, the suppliers to that plant desperately need the airport to be in close proximity to Greensburg. So there's an ongoing battle about trying to get the Greensburg Airport expanded so these suppliers can send in their technicians, parts, etc. that may need to be there. And so it's been a 7+ year battle up to this point. But the jobs that would be created are not there at the Honda plant, but they're being created where these suppliers are based out of. One other thing that's probably interesting to point out here is that jobs in a lot of studies that states are starting to undertake are becoming the emphasis of the importance of airports, because in our nation, jobs seems to be the holy grail of what we're trying to accomplish. Historically, a lot of the airport benefit reports focused on economic value in a dollar figure, and a lot of those didn't translate nicely to jobs. So we're starting to see a lot more reports coming out, for instance, from North Carolina here, pointing out that 15,000 jobs are supported by the general aviation industry. There's numbers that have been recently published that 1.2 million jobs in the United States are supported by general aviation. So a lot of information is coming out about jobs. One other thing that's really important to point out is that oftentimes these jobs at airports particularly do pay higher wages than the state averages. And Virginia recently published a report that concluded that as well. But going back to some of the older studies, and even some of the newer studies are still picking up on economic vitality and in addition to the jobs, but you'll see numbers like these. And again, Virginia is reporting, Kansas, for instance, is reporting in a report that they have $7.1 billion in contributing from the aviation industry. The last bullet point there that's of interest to me is that site selection criteria for some businesses, it actually is a very high priority. And just in recent weeks, I was made aware of a scorecard from a company from Japan that was looking in the Midwest for a new facility. And it was actually their second highest criteria on their scorecard. So it's one of those things where depending on the type of company, they may or may not, just like railroad, they may or may not need rail access. But there are companies out there, and if you're not in the game, if you don't have a general aviation airport, you just won't even make the list. As a matter of fact, you know, it's funny that we talk about site selection, but oftentimes when these companies are looking for a site, it's site elimination. And what I mean by that is that if you don't have the items on their list, you're just eliminated. And they're really just trying to whittle down every possible community that might serve their needs. Supporting local business operations is another reason why airports are valuable. They do serve areas that just don't have metropolitan, international airports. So again, going back to my Greensburg example, it's literally 1 hour and a few minutes from the Indianapolis International Airport. So if you had a corporation that needed to deliver a part or needed to get a technician to that Honda plant, they would have to fly into the international airport, drive an hour back to the international airport before they depart. In all, because of the transition times as well that you would spend at an international airport, they can save 2 to 3 hours per flight just in transition. So it's quite valuable to businesses. One thing I was going to do is just bear with me. I understand the video quality of this may not be that great, but hopefully the sound will come through. I'm just going to jump out of this presentation for a moment and let you hear a 30-second clip from our from the famed golfer Arnold Palmer. You can look this up on YouTube if you want to see the video clarity a little better. Just type in Arnold Palmer and then plane, P-L-A-N-E, and you'll be able to pick this up.
I'm going to tell you something you haven't heard in a while, the truth about business aviation. The truth is that for more than 50 years, using business airplanes is the single most productive thing I have done. It's given me the opportunity to compete more effectively in golf and in business. and it's enabled me to do both from a place not served by the airlines. I'm Lionel Palmer, and I approve this message simply because it's true.
Okay, jumping back over to the PowerPoint presentation. The thing I like about that is that it does pick up on the fact that international airports don't always get you close to where you want to be or close to where you're based out of. And Arnold Palmer happens to be based out of a community that does not have close access to an international airport. Another thing that I want to point out on this slide is that there's been some recent controversy ever since the three executives from the auto industry flew out to D.C. to testify to Congress and they flew in their private planes. There's been this rift towards the general aviation industry. And even the airline industry has picked up on it and trying to blemish the general aviation industry. And so this Arnold Palmer ad was a response to that negative publicity that the general aviation industry had been getting. Some other values of airports is transportation, just simply being able to get persons from one place to another. We sort of touched on that already, but it's important to point out that statistically 30% of the time those airplanes are used is that they're transporting executives. The perception is that it's 90+% of the time that they're transporting executives. In reality, it's more like 60% of the time they're transporting technicians, parts, mid-level employees, sales staff, that type of personnel. And they actually are using it as a business tool more so than as a luxury. And the other value of airports, another value of airports is recreation, whether it's fly-ins, air shows, private pilot flights, people going out and looking at vintage aircraft. There's lots of different reasons why airports can be of value, tourism, value to communities. And then some miscellaneous items are agricultural benefits, air ambulances, running and delivering organs, cannot fly, or at least generally are not typically on the paid airlines. They're usually using small aircraft for those. And lastly, I'll go back to that slide. It's also, these airports create a safety net essentially for aircraft that may get into trouble. It's a blanket of airports that are around the nation. If you recall that map of the United States and how many airports there are, those are alternative landing sites for aircraft that may have to divert. All right, a few additional facts about airports. There's about 20,000 airports and airstrips in the nation. That's every grass strip, private, public included. When you really look at the numbers, it's more like 5,200 public airports, and only 75% of those, or maybe I shouldn't say only, but 75% of those are have paved runways. One other thing to point out is that when communities, those redevelopment commissions, or maybe municipal government is looking at that airport and saying, hey, it's not really performing that well, maybe we can you hear that term a lot too, or those words a lot. Maybe we can just move it out to the country. We've encroached upon it, now we just need to move it. Well, the replacement value, replacement cost of these airports can be quite high. We know of an example where two general aviation airports that are being encroached upon in neighboring cities, we're looking at closing those two and building a new airport. The cost of buying the land and building that facility was going to be about $121 million, and that was for a single runway airport, no crosswind runway. Certainly they were going to buy the land for the crosswind runway, but could not justify the cost to do that. I'm going to transition over to the impacts of airport, because obviously they're not all just beneficial. Let's see, here we go, impacts of airports. Well, obviously the number one issue is noise. And people always are worried about their property values declining. Now, although this picture really doesn't have anything to do with airports, it portrays the feeling that the neighbors have when airports are about to expand or operations are expanding. They feel like their property values are falling off a cliff. They also feel like their quality of life is being diminished, and they feel powerless against that. So those certainly are real issues that have to be addressed when we're looking at airport planning, airport expansion, airport compatibility. So talking a little bit more about noise, you'll sometimes see images like this of an airport where sound contours have been drawn through year-long studies to understand where the decibel levels are in proximity to that airport. And they're not just nice concentric circles around the airport, because aircraft typically are flying, at least larger aircraft typically fly in direct paths. Smaller aircraft fly in patterns and sort of loop the airport before landing. Each airport is going to be quite different based on topography, based on the number of operations, the hour of those operations, the aircraft type coming in and out of there. Some of the good things, though, are that some policies in those airports can help. So there is some mitigation opportunities there, meaning that aircraft are bound by or guided by throttling up procedures, throttling down procedures. They certainly have to keep the aircraft afloat, but aloft, but they can actually fly in and out. And oftentimes when you're in commercial aircraft, you'll notice that pilots are throttling up, throttling down in those transitions away from the airport or even towards the airport. And that's a lot of times due to these sound policies, trying to be a better neighbor to the surrounding property owners. Last thing there is just to point out that even though the gold standard really is a mitigation when sound levels get above 65 decibels, sometimes 55 or 60 decibel levels is a better local standard. And what I mean by that is that 65 is still pretty loud. And if you're experiencing 64 decibels of noise, therefore your property isn't being mitigated, you may still have either frustrations, or some people talk about health effects of noise and property value effects of noise. So in areas where the ambient noise is lower, rural airports for instance, the 65 decibel contour may not be the best level to be considered for mitigation or for concern. Moving on to property values and reduced quality of life, again, both of those factors do tend to get tied back to noise. So their quality of life when they're sleeping, their enjoyment of their property tend to be what's at stake, and a lot of that boils down to noise. I hear testimony frequently where people say, hey, I love to watch airplanes. They're great. I like to see them. I just don't want to hear them when I'm sleeping. So that's the type of operational times that they're really not happy about. Also, lighting can come into play. The lighting at airports sometimes is a complaint. And then lastly is the restriction of land uses. If there is an overlay, or if there are some restrictions that have been imposed on the neighboring property owners, they feel slighted. They feel like they are having their property taken from them. And so those are some things that airports can cause as an impact. Crashes. Again, people are concerned about aircraft coming down. Statistically, most crashes happen close to airports. And in a study done by Berkeley University, if you were to draw a rectangle 20,000 feet wide by 40,000 feet long and center that on the runway, almost every crash that they studied over a many-year period of time, and probably is the most extensive database of plottings of crashes in relationship to runways, is that almost every one of them is within that rectangle. Similarly, if you drew a rectangle that's 10,000 feet by 20,000 feet, so basically half the dimensions, that 86% of the crashes were in that rectangle. So that gives you a sense of how, statistically at least, how close to airports those crashes do take place. And there often is loss of life and loss of property in those accidents. So that obviously is an impact of airports. Growth boundaries. Airports, and maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but having this large land use that it becomes a growth boundary, meaning that not every land use is an appropriate land use in proximity to it, can be a negative impact to your community that may be growing in that direction. Maybe the market forces are pushing really hard in that direction and starting to gobble up land in proximity to the airport, and for that reason it might be something that's very difficult to work around. And lastly, I just saw a few people jump in the audience there. That's a webinar joke, I guess. I'm curious if anyone knows what these two species are. But without having a good way to hear your comments, I'm sure the lady in red there in South Carolina knows that that's the Indiana bat there on the bottom left, an endangered species that has caused airports a lot of money to mitigate the impacts to this species. And the bird on the right is a grasshopper sparrow, and again an endangered species that is costing airports a lot of money to mitigate and to try to protect. Oftentimes we have these conflicts where land may have wetlands on it, and airports almost always bulldoze those wetlands and mitigate them elsewhere farther away from the airport, trying to keep away any kind of bird species, especially migratory birds. All right, so that concludes the part about the value of airports and the impacts of airports. Some of the trends in airports, again, these are things that we are often asked when we're talking about whether or not we should protect these general aviation airports. Some of the positive trends are that we're just in the last year starting to see again an uptick in private pilot certificates. The aviation industry is starting to see an uptick in fuel consumption sales. The FAA actually projects out to the year 2025 and suggests that the fleet of vehicles is going to increase. The dark green bar at the top is starting to show the inclusion of very light jets, the VLJs. I'll talk about those here in a minute. And the dark blue at the bottom are piston aircraft, your Cessnas, your smaller aircraft that are out there. Some other positive trends are that we are starting to see flight activity in general increasing. I mentioned very light jets. These are a few images of very light jets. The reason why this is something that's hotly talked about in the aviation industry is that these jets are going to give corporations particularly the opportunity to buy and participate in fleet of aircraft that are cheaper and much more fuel efficient. And because they have pretty small needs as far as airport facilities, they're highly desirable. And as these aircraft are being developed, the one at the top right is a Cessna. It's already being sold and is being utilized today. The bottom left one is one from Cirrus and is also one that is in development, late stages of development. I believe they're starting to deliver those soon, or maybe they have already started to deliver those. Some of the negative trends, though, and we have to be honest, is that it's a tough industry. So some of the negative trends are deliveries of new aircraft is way down. The aviation industry is struggling in the current economy. We're losing about one general aviation airport per week in the United States. That's shown statistically on a national basis and just sort of generalized. But It's partially due to remonstration against those airports from folks that moved in close proximity to that, not realizing what impact they would have to live with. Sometimes it's due to other issues. And in Chicago, this is Meigs Field, one of the more popular airports that was bulldozed. I'm not sure how many years ago that was now. It's been quite a while ago, but Mayor Daley was certainly scrutinized by the aviation industry for bulldozing the airport in the dark of night. At least that's how it's told in the aviation industry. But it may have been the right thing to do for Chicago. I'm not here to say whether or not that was the right policy or not. Just pointing out that the trend is that we're losing airports across the country. Some of them are airfields like this that were very, very popular, and others are small grass strips that served the public at some point in our history but really aren't doing so well today, and they just closed the doors. So the question is, what should we do? As planners, as municipal representatives, what are we going to do? How do we plan for airports? Well, the first thing really is to determine whether or not this general aviation airport should be saved. There's an ongoing philosophical debate about airports. I am an advocate for airports, but not necessarily every airport. We're really operating in a system, sort of an antiquated system, where historically we needed that blanket of small airports across the country because aircraft had smaller fuel tanks, shorter ranges, would have situations where they need to land prematurely. Whatever it may be, is that they needed that blanket of airports around the nation. Today, things have changed, and so we have states that are starting to reevaluate whether or not every general aviation airport is essential. In my home state here of Indiana, my understanding is they're going through an exercise now to start to prioritize which airports are the most important, which ones may be less important, and that may start to affect the funding that goes to these airports. So the ones that are essential will be the ones that are getting funded first. Closing some of these airports may not be so bad. They may provide a great opportunity for redevelopment, and maybe there is an alternative location. In the Indianapolis area, again, just using my home state as an example, there's 4 or 5 general aviation airports in and around the city, in addition to the international airport. The question is, do we need to have every one of them functioning as a commercial or reliever type of an airport? And the answer is no, but somebody's got to make those tough decisions about which ones we keep and which ones we don't. Airports also can be quite different from each other. In some cases, we have worked on airports that are the perfect fit for a reliever airport. They're not there today, but the writing's on the wall, and they really need to step it up and protect the land around the airport. They need to start working on funding for the facility upgrades to be able to get there before the demand is there. However, there's other airports that really are just serving recreational aircraft. Maybe there's no businesses in the vicinity that benefit from the airport. Maybe there's no businesses that utilize the airport. And again, there might be a cause for that airport to be phased out. One thing that we hear from time to time is that because the airport took federal funding at some point in its past, part of the agreements when you take those airport, the FAA's dollars, is that you sign an agreement, and the last time I looked into it, there was something like 35 different clauses in there that you're, as the sponsor, as the person receiving the funding, you're committing to do. And one of those is to keep the airport open for 20 years. Well, if you're 15 years into that or 10 years into that and there's just no aircraft using the airport, should we still keep it open? How do we honor this agreement that we signed? So we have airports that are concerned about having to pay back the money that was given to them for airport improvements. I've heard, and I don't have this validated other than through one source, but is that Meigs Field that I mentioned earlier, when it was taken out of commission, is that even though Meigs Field had received grant money and aid money from the federal government, is that they were not required to pay that back. And so there is an agreement that says you have to pay it back, but in practice we're hearing that they're really not being pursued for that money. And there's a case, a funny story, and I'll move on to the next slide here in just a moment. There's a funny story that was on the news not too long ago. A television station had picked up on this small community that had, as community leaders, decided they really didn't need their general aviation airport. It just wasn't being used. And so this news reporter went out there and was covering the story, and at the end of the story he said, well, just for fun, I'm going to stay here until the next airplane lands and just see how busy this airport really is. And so he sets up his lawn chair and they start to go through a time-lapse video edit, and it's 3 days later that an aircraft finally comes in and lands at the airport so he can go home. So there are airports that may not be important to the transportation network or to local businesses, and are possible opportunities for redevelopment or reuse. But I would always suggest to communities that if you want to, and if you've come to the conclusion that you want to protect your general aviation airport, is that you really need to educate yourselves, all the stakeholders. Go to the State Department of Transportation, often has studies. Most states have aeronautical or aeronautical associations that have conducted studies and understand the economic values of every airport. In Indiana, they concluded a similar study. I know in North Carolina, Virginia, Kansas, Texas, I mean a lot of states, and those are just the ones that I've looked into, most states seem to have some kind of economic evaluation of those airports, whether it's the benefit of jobs or the benefit to the economy. And so that's a place to start to understand how valuable your airport is, certainly involving the AOPA, which is the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, also organizations like the National Business Aviation Association, NBAA, can provide information about airports and aircraft and the value that it may be providing to your community. Certainly the FAA and the pilots that may be in your community will help you understand what value the airport really is providing. Just because we're not seeing a steady stream of aircraft in and out of an airport doesn't mean that it isn't providing an enormous amount of value to a particular community. I think it's in some of the airports that we've studied over the years. I mean, it's not uncommon to find huge numbers, $1.5 million of annual revenue into the economy, a couple $100 million of revenue into an economy for medium and larger general aviation airports is not uncommon at all. So start with that kind of information. But to protect general aviation airports, folks need to start looking at them as critical infrastructure and a major investment. Go back and study how much money has been invested into that facility over time. Look at how much money the FAA has invested in it, or the state has invested in the airport. Oftentimes the largest dollars are coming from those sources. Look at how it is an economic driver in the community, how it might be utilized as a site selection criteria for your economic development authority. when you're planning for airports as well, obviously you want to protect the overall public's interest, which involves safety, quality of life, jobs, and transportation. It may be just one time every 5 years that somebody has the opportunity to get in a small aircraft and fly to a place for tourism purposes or for business purposes, but had that airport not been there, would have been more of an inconvenience for that person or for that particular need that may have arisen. And lastly there, when you plan for airports, is to make sure we're protecting the neighbors. It's a tough situation. It's no different than when you have an industry that's been around for a long time in your community and it's wanting to expand, and the neighbors get upset or concerned about what might happen. Maybe they've tolerated the level of truck traffic in and out to this industry, and now they know it's going to expand and it's going to be much, much worse. We have to be aware of what those legacy farms mean to people, what a person's home means to them, what businesses might be impacted, a nursing home type of a facility, a hospital that might be affected by an airport. And generally, we believe that people have the right to enjoy their property, and we need to, as planners, just like we do with any other not in my backyard scenario, need to put in place the right policies to listen to, understand, mitigate, and facilitate that dialogue. Speaking more specifically about protecting general aviation airports, I equate this to, what would you do to protect a highway or a major arterial in your community? Maybe it's a collector today, and in your thoroughfare plan, you know that it's going to become an arterial street. And so maybe you have 60 feet of right-of-way today, and you need to get to 200 feet or 150 feet or whatever it may be, depending on if it's a highway or an arterial street. Would you today allow somebody on that corridor to build within 50 feet of the road? Probably not, because we want to protect that thoroughfare plan. Same thing with airports, is we want to have that airport plan made available through a comprehensive plan, through public engagements, to let people know, put people on notice, so when they're investing their dollars, whether it's a room addition or a new house or a new business, is that they're making informed decisions about what that airport impact might be to them in the future, so they can make choices to add insulation to their house and get to a new sound classification, so that they're not impacted by the airport as much if they're within proximity. Same thing, like I said before, is what would you do to protect an industry or large employer in your community? If you know they're ripe for expansion, you start years ahead of time if you can, and you start to mitigate what can go in proximity to that industry. Some other things in regard to protecting general aviation airports. Encroachment is the #1 issue. People will tell me all the time that tall structures, we got to control tall structures. You see there at the very bottom, tall structures account for less than 1 accident per year in the United States. And that is even though we have a proliferation of cell towers in the nation. This number has been pretty static for the last 25 years. And even though, again, the proliferation of towers is exponential, what's different, or what is more important, is the wildlife management. There's 13 causes or factors of accidents per year due to wildlife management. That means the aircraft actually crashed. I'll talk a little bit more here about the number of aircraft that have been hit by wildlife or vice versa here in a moment, but keep in mind that encroachment is the #1 issue. That's what's closing airports. The second one that I want to mention there is that incompatible land uses in proximity. And I'm going to cover those in a couple of slides here coming up. Encroachment. This is an airport that was in the sticks. It was not surrounded by any development at all. This is what it looks like today. The airport was there first. Folks should have known that this airport was there when they tried to expand it, add a crosswind runway. They actually owned the land, or it was in their facility plan for many years. It was strongly remonstrated against and is really, at this point, slated for either stagnation or termination. It really is just not going to grow as an airport because of what has encroached upon it in its context. Encroachment, what do we mean by that, is the non-compatible land uses, residential places of assembly. You don't, churches don't want to have aircraft noise buzzing overhead on their Sunday or Saturday services, Wednesday night services. Also other noise-sensitive uses, schools, museums, nursing homes, hospitals. The places of assembly also can include things like stadiums, outdoor stadiums or amphitheaters. Those are the things that we don't want to have close to airports. Incompatible land uses, they don't have to be adjacent to the airport or even in close proximity to the airport. The FAA is actually concerned about landfills in particular within 6 miles of any general aviation airport. Sometimes we even hear stories of concerns over those landfills being within 10 miles and airports that are on the cusp of not getting federal funding because they're within 10 miles of a landfill. So it can affect whether or not your airport actually gets that federal funding, which can be up to 90% of the facility improvements costs. And certainly the 6-mile mark is in recent years become law, federal law, that a new landfill cannot be located within 6 miles of an airport. So the FAA now has a little broader authority to restrict where landfills can actually go. But not always do folks think about other incompatible land uses. Golf courses are actually considered an incompatible land use in proximity to airports. Retention ponds as well. Those popular things that, standing water in subdivisions or around industrial parks are considered an incompatible use of land. The FAA and airports would prefer all retention facilities to be dry detention facilities with under drains, so that within 48 hours after the largest storm event, the 100-year storm event, is that they're dry again. And again, that's the reason why airports will mitigate any wetlands that are on their property or in near proximity to their property. If you really want to protect your airports, you do have to resist that urge to redevelop. I'm not suggesting that in any community they've made the wrong decision. That really is a local study that needs to determine that. The aviation industry obviously wants to protect them all, but in some cases, again, there's reasons for and need for and advantages to redeveloping those sites. But we only ask that folks first try to consider development options that add compatible land uses around the perimeter of that airport, or that transition from that airport on the context of that airport, and try to encourage that versus just bulldozing the place and moving on. One of the things that's harmed by, even if a community can afford to abandon a site and redevelop it, usually the site that would be chosen to replace it is so far away from where it was before that the corporations that had based aircraft at that airport no longer are interested in having aircraft, because they have to now drive 30 miles from where they were at or from where they're located to that new general aviation airport. And it might be shiny bells and whistles and everything that they always dreamed about in an airport, but because of its proximity, it wipes out the business model that made it actually a reality. So again, study needs to be conducted to find the best solutions for airports. Wildlife management. Again, if you want to be serious about protecting airports, you really have to learn about wildlife management. 1990 through 2008, there's 90,000 strikes with aircraft versus wildlife. 87,500 of those were birds. That probably makes sense to most people. Well, what's the other things? Well, it's things like, well, these are the bird strike images. There's a huge risk to aircraft. There in the middle on the bottom, you know, everyone's probably familiar with on January 2009, the U.S. Air Flight 1549 that ingested a couple of Canada geese and was forced to land in the Hudson River. These accidents do happen. Oftentimes there are injuries. Luckily, in that case, Sully, the pilot, was very experienced and was able to bring everyone safely home. But not always is that the case. The doctor that may have an airplane that flies once a month may not have that skill set to be able to keep his head in the game when he gets struck by a bird, and oftentimes those are pretty disastrous. I'll go back to the previous slide. Those 90,000 collisions with wildlife caused about $500 million in damage each year, and about 630,000 hours of downtime for that aircraft, or for those aircraft. So it's a big issue. Wildlife management, like I said, it's not just birds. It's deer, it's alligators, polar bears. I mean, there's something like 240 species of animals that have been documented on runways and airport facilities. So one of the things we ask communities to not be concerned about is fencing around those airports. Oftentimes it takes 2 feet of underground fence for burrowing animals to not be able to get on the premise, as well as a 10 to 12 foot fence around the perimeter to keep deer out. I've been told that a properly motivated deer can clear a 10-foot fence. So it is important to have tall fences around these airports. Again, tall structures, they're not as big of a concern, but I don't want to say that you should just say we're not going to regulate tall structures. What I'm trying to say is that the regulations that are in place either by the state or local jurisdictions is working. With only one collision with a tall structure per year, the provisions that are in place seem to be working, and let's not emphasize that or try to restudy that. It seems to be a pretty good system. Protecting the public's interests. What we're talking about here is, you know, informing the community about the benefits. We're talking about making sure people understand that as part of the public infrastructure, promote compatibility, and add it to your comprehensive plan so that, again, any kind of planning documents are also sharing the future of this facility. I can't tell you how many comprehensive plans we read that just have no mention at all about the airports that are in their jurisdiction. And certainly, even if they do have a mention of them, they're really not talking about what the future of that airport is. Protecting the neighbors' rights. We think the communities, even though they may not have jurisdiction over the airport, because it's maybe an airport authority or airport aviation board of some sort, is that we think that the municipalities need to be engaged in facilitation and encouraging that communication, even if there's not an ongoing conflict with the neighbors. Also promoting those airport policies to help mitigate noise and so on. All right, moving on to compatibility, airport compatibility zoning. So what would you like, what would this zoning ordinance look like, or this amendment look like? Well, first of all, there's 4 components that need to be looked at first. One is the state and federal laws. If you're not familiar with those as they relate to the aviation industry, get familiar with those. Look into the studies and statistics that are out there. There's advisory circulars. I'll talk about those in a moment, and certainly the stakeholders. And I'm not talking about just the adjacent landowners. I'm talking about the pilots associations, the business aviation industries representatives. They're all happy to be a part of these processes. They're pretty fair folks. They're not just in it to win it. They want that balanced conversation. The FAA advisory circulars, these are some of the critical ones. It's important to note that the second one on that list there is a canceled advisory circular. It's still available. You can query that on Google and find the advisory circular and read it. Not exactly sure what the history is, why it's been canceled, but it still does provide some degree of guidance for land use compatibility. But the other ones are there for wildlife, for noise, for airport design, etc. I'll mention one other thing about advisory circulars before covering this slide, and that is that when airports receive grant in aid, so they receive that federal dollars, part of the commitments that you're making when you take that money is that you're committing to follow those advisory circulars. So they, in effect, become mandatory to the extent possible. So even though they have that term advisory in the title, if you're receiving that money, there's an expectation that you're going to take them pretty seriously. Studies and statistics here. University of California at Berkeley, I mentioned this study earlier, the 10,000 by 20,000 rectangle and the 20,000 by 40,000 rectangle. Great report. Some other ones you'll find through different organizations, whether it's your state. The one on the left there is Wisconsin's report, and then there's also many other reports being pumped out, and I think it's important to learn those, read those before starting to undertake a zoning regulation. So some specific suggestions. First of all, within 6 statute miles of an airport, even though it is federal law, landfills are not permitted. It's not a bad idea to have that be written into your own ordinances so that local jurisdictions know that, understand that. And you might even, again, if you have an important airport, something you're really trying to protect, is you might start thinking about prohibiting any other facilities with protrusible waste. Basically any kind of waste that would really attract shorebirds, migratory birds, or raptors. That 6 statute miles is, again, if it is a major attractor of birds and you have a really important airport, that might be something you want to consider. Within 3 statute miles, again, depending on if you're trying to protect a larger general aviation airport, a really important feature in your community, I say discourage, but you may want to make some of this mandatory or prohibitive instead of discouraging it. But this is a short list of items that don't really play nicely with airports within proximity. You might also, instead of just drawing a circle around your airport, look at the flight routes and just emphasize those flight routes as an overlay where you're either discouraging or prohibiting these particular land uses. Within 5,000 or 10,000 feet, and the reason why I have both numbers, it depends. The FAA's advisory circular differentiates between piston aircraft and turbine aircraft. So if you're a larger commercial general aviation airport, it's going to be a 10,000 foot standard, and if you're just a piston craft recreational airport, you're probably going to be at the 5,000 feet. So it depends on the airport that you're protecting, but things you want to prohibit are listed here on this slide. This is going to be copied and made available after the presentation. I'm not going to read through them. Within runway extensions, so again, depending on if it's a larger airport, smaller airport, commercial versus recreation, these numbers will vary, but you want to start looking at that extension of the runway. So 2 miles out, 5 miles out from the extension, and you're wanting to discourage or prohibit, again, depending on how important it is to protect the airport, certainly schools, hospitals, and large places of assembly. We're aware of communities that have put casinos, horse racing tracks, college campuses, stadiums, that kind of thing, in direct line of airport runways. And again, if you draw that box, that 20,000 by 40,000 box, that is where aircraft come down. And you don't want to have those schools, hospitals, large places of assembly within that rectangle. within 1 nautical mile, and we've switched here from statute mile to nautical mile, and that's because the advisory circulars use that term. We're really talking about, instead of 5280, we're talking about a little over 6,000 feet, so it's a nautical mile is different, or the noise contour. So if your airport has had a study and has differentiated the 55 decibel line, the 65 decibel line, the 75 decibel line, is that you can write the code to be respectful of that and create the overlays that prohibit noise-sensitive uses within those boundaries. There are people that will want to live in close proximity to airports, or that will want to start a business within close proximity to airports. We actually believe that you can write policies tightly enough where they can waive their right to remonstrate against the airport's expansion in the future and let them be there. We sometimes write regulations that will add sound classification requirements as well, so that if they do go into that areas, they have to add extra insulation and sound mitigation measures into their structure so that it does not become a nuisance. We do have studies, or we know of studies, where noise has impacts the ability of kids to study in school or to sleep, people to sleep in the evenings. So there's lab studies as well as real-world studies that have been conducted. And for that reason, we do want to be concerned about the impacts of noise. A few more slides here. We're going to wrap up and take questions. Also within the 1 nautical mile or the noise contour areas, and these are, again, based on advice that comes from advisory circulars and studies and reports. It's a sort of a combination of that, but one thing that's mentioned is how densely residential, if it is going to be in these areas, how dense should it be? And they even speak about the minimum lot size for residential, making sure that it's a really low density. And again, I think this has to be determined locally. I don't think there's any global advice that can be given to any one community. But these are some numbers that are mentioned out there in the industry. Also, the wildlife attractiveness, again, it's a local, if your community is in the migratory patterns of certain waterfowl, you may have to mitigate greater than somebody that does not have that circumstance. Also, airports like to have cutoff fixtures used in proximity to airports. So folks that want to have the big floodlight in their backyard that shines upwards and outwards, you might have regulations that forbid those types of light fixtures being used. All right, with that, actually one more slide here. The commercial industry or commercial or industrial overlay is something to consider, something that is implemented out there, meaning that the underlying zoning may just allow agricultural uses or maybe industrial uses, but it's possible to broaden that with an overlay district, meaning that maybe the caveat in the overlay district states that if when you develop your land it's contiguous to another industry or contiguous to the airport property, you're allowed to have, and you can have the laundry list of uses that are compatible with airports as a permission by right. You can also, if there's a specific theme to the airport that you're trying to accomplish, is to have that overlay either grant by right or through conditions, those uses to be integrated in and added to the areas close to that airport. And the last thing is that we think that in a zoning ordinance is that the zoning administrators need to have some level of discretion if your community is tolerant of that and if your state statutes are tolerant of that, meaning that we can't always foresee every noise-sensitive land use, and so the exhaustive lists may not forbid something that would be noise-sensitive. Also, there may be some life safety risks that were unforeseen in the regulations, or a wildlife attractant that wasn't specifically outlined in the ordinance. So we'd like to see a general clause that allows the zoning administrator under certain circumstances to deem something a noise-sensitive land use and therefore forbid it within those noise contours or within proximity of the airport. All right, so with that, we're going to start taking some questions. I've got Brittany and Sarah here at my office that are going to help facilitate this. So we'll
Okay, great, Brad. Let's go ahead, and our first question here is going to be, are VLJs likely to start increasing the noise impacts at general aviation airports?
I've got two answers for that. One is that they tend to be quieter aircraft, and they tend to have the capabilities of taking off and landing in a quieter mode, meaning that they don't have to use the full throttle through the departure procedure, and they are designed to be less noisy. I mean, that is one of the design criteria that they are striving for. The other thing is that VLJs typically are going to be a corporate aircraft, and although you do have those aircraft coming in and out in earlier morning hours and later, evening hours, meaning 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, you'll hear them sometimes, but most of them are daytime operations. Here in Indianapolis, we've got a FedEx hub, and just as put it in perspective, they land 130 very large aircraft between midnight and 3 a.m. And I mean, it's just a string of pearls when you look at the sky during those hours. And the people that live in proximity of that airport are impacted by noise much more than the daytime operations. And so we're not as concerned about the VLJs just because of the time of day that they typically are operating. Next question.
Great. Can we get the source of that fact about the less than 1% of tall structures cause accidents each year? Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah. And actually, myself and Sarah here at my office have been talking with the NTSB this week. It's taken a week to actually get updated information. I had 5 years ago studied this and looked at NTSB crash statistics, and I had to sort of assemble it all on my own and had to make some deductions at that point, and we had concluded safely that it was less than 15 strikes per year, and that's what we have been touting. But I wanted to update that, and we actually, now the NTSB shares their database, and you can contact Carol Floyd at the NTSB. She's their statistician. Her phone number is 202. She'll probably love me for passing this out, but her phone number is 202-314-6553, and she can either provide the link to download the database or can provide a report of those statistics. But it's pretty shocking, actually. And if you can actually look at all of the collision data over the last 25 years or so.
Great.
I will mention that there's other agencies that sort of monitor crash statistics. Their databases may be different, but we felt pretty comfortable relying on the NTSB. Okay.
Okay. Well, our next question is, so noise-sensitive land use. The list should include residential neighborhoods within primary flight paths. Why were they excluded?
Well, I put in residential in general, but neighborhoods certainly, any kind of organized residential development really should be excluded from noise-sensitive areas. I apologize for not calling that out specifically. Any kind of condominium development, apartment development, nursing home, assisted living care facilities, all of that, any place where people reside, we believe should be out of those areas. And even to err on the side of caution, again, you'll see these contour lines drawn on maps if your airport's been fortunate enough to be mapped. And a lot of times that 65 decibel level is where the threshold is drawn as far as where you have impact and where you don't have impact. But sound is just not that perfect. And matter of fact, the measurement system at least frustrates the neighbors because the the FAA's gold standard for measuring sound and drawing those sound contours looks at the average day-night sound levels over the course of a year. Well, they also then give credit for sort of I should say, the formula actually takes into place hours in the late evening and treats them differently. And it's considered a fair system, but when the neighbors hear about it and sort of know that they're being awakened in the middle of the night with aircraft flying over, they don't feel like it accurately represents the impact to their house. So I would rather communities be more cautious about specifically residential uses and trying to keep them outside of a 55 decibel or greater sound contour, just to be on the safe side. And this is coming up a lot with regulations in regard to wind farms. The wind farm industry and folks that are writing regulations for them seem to have picked up on this 50 or 65 decibel level as being the gold standard, but folks that are living in proximity or experiencing more than 65 decibels are impacted by that. So again, you go to other nations and they do not use a 65 decibel level. They use, and again I'm talking this time about wind industry, is that they're using 60, 55, even 50. We've heard of some communities or some countries that actually have as a national standards that people cannot be impacted by a 40 decibel level, which is way on the probably the extreme side. And again, that's all in regards to wind turbine noise. But we want you to use caution when folks are telling you that you should use a 65 decibel contour for residential.
Okay, great. Our next question comes from one of our attendees who lives in an area where one town, which owns an airport, recommends incoming flights fly over a neighboring town instead of the ocean because of residents who are wealthy and living on the ocean don't want to hear the planes they use to come and go. As a result, one town bears the noise brunt and they have no access to the airport of another town's benefit. How does the FAA resolve these disputes?
Oh, I don't know if I have any specific examples of that. I've not had a scenario like that I can really speak to as an example either. Obviously, the FAA is one of the first places to stop and talk with and see what the history is. The perception may be is that the rich folks are pushing their airplanes off on the other folks, but there may actually be a technical reason why the flight path has been drawn the way it is. It may not be a lobbied result. But I think the first thing to do is to try to figure out and document that history, and you may find that there is another cause. It's unfortunate if that actually has happened, because the FAA should not be showing favoritism from one community to another. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, our next question is, why are golf courses a non-compatible use? Cleveland Burke Lakefront had plans for a golf course adjacent to the airport. They're not sure if that's still the plan.
Well, the number one reason is they're a wildlife attractant. You'll see Canada geese and other migratory birds that will, golf courses typically want to have ponds and wide open green spaces. Just the practices, it's not uncommon to see wildlife on golf courses. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not always incompatible. What communities are able to do in their zoning regulations is to, as a special exception or through a conditional approval process, is to have wildlife mitigation strategies incorporated into the design of that golf course. Maybe they have less ponds, or maybe they have tall grasses growing on the edge which deters Canada geese from landing there or feeling safe there. If they're not in a migratory pattern, maybe there's not an issue with open ponds anyway. So it's going to be a site-specific restriction or consideration, but generally speaking, in the advisory circulars, they suggest that golf courses are not compatible for those reasons.
Okay, great. Our next question is, do you have any recommendations for standards of locating industrial developments in proximity to airports?
You know, as long as they're not on the airfield, and as long as they don't have waste or any kind of outdoor storage of products or waste that would attract birds or other type of wildlife, you know, they can be fairly close. There are a couple of advisory circulars, one that really suggests that it's a great compatible use, and others that say that intense industries with lots of employees would not be a good compatible use. And I think that's mostly due to, you know, if an aircraft comes down and you've got a lot of people per square foot in your industrial facility, as there's chance of loss of life. But in general, they're all considered pretty compatible land uses as long as they're not on the airport property, and as long as they're not encroaching in areas that the airport intends to use long-term for operations or expansion of those operations. And all of that information should be available through the airport's facility plan and airport manager, or through the state's Department of Transportation, as far as having the information as to where is the best locations for those industries. Interestingly enough, recreation is the other big promoted compatible use with airports. So whether it's soccer fields or, you know, some kind of formal recreational facilities, again, as long as it's not large assemblies of people, they're considered really good compatible uses, and so you might consider that as a neighbor to the airport.
Okay, great. The distance measurement regulations, where are they measured from? The end of the runway or the airport property?
Actually, the advisory circulars will mention that, but generally speaking, we're looking at the airport operations area. So it's not necessarily every square foot of the airport's property. Most of the regulations are going to be measured from any area that is considered a place where aircraft are going to be. So the run-up areas, the runways, the taxiways, the aprons, any critical facilities of the airport. But if an airport has 1,000 acres and the airport really is just sitting on 500 of those acres, the presumption isn't that the other remaining 500 acres has to be buffered equally. We also, at least we try to advise communities to use the airport facility plan, so where they want to be in 20 years, where they want to be in 5 years, 10 years, to actually set that bar, though, for the air operations areas, because they may have, in a short period of time, the opportunity to add a crosswind runway, and it's better to have those being designated and planned for today than waiting for it to be built and trying to then mitigate things that have encroached into those noise-sensitive areas. So it's the AOA, and then it's also, it should be taken into consideration those advancements of the facilities that are anticipated.
Great. So our next question comes in. It's my local airport, Oakland International Airport, features the general aviation facility adjacent to the commercial airport. Do you suppose it's better to have both types of airports in the same area, or better to keep them physically well separated? I'm
probably not the right person to ask that. Sometimes general aviation airports and international airports work really well together because they share a tower control and the aircraft can safely be guided in and out of the airport. There's actually a point at which a general aviation airport is too close, but usually that's when they're, say, 3, 5, 8 miles away from that international airport, is they tend to be more of a problem at those distances, but immediately adjacent I could see there being some advantages to that. But so I probably have to leave it there.
Okay. Could you suggest some compatible uses close to an airport that are not directly airport related?
Well, again, recreation adjacent to airports is considered favorable, and again, that could be passive recreation or active recreation. Again, keeping in mind the wildlife mitigation aspect of it. If it's passive recreation, tall fences may be able to mitigate the fox or deer from getting onto a runway, even though there's a nice woodlot or a forest next to the airport. So those are all good compatible uses. Interestingly enough, agriculture, and I didn't mention it earlier, but agriculture is not considered a great compatible land use. But the FAA advisory circulars do state that when an airport relies on the income from agricultural use, is that they can do it. And in Indiana, again, just as an example, is probably 95% of the airports receive essential funding, cash flow from leasing out their land to agricultural uses. But because it can be during certain times of the season a bird attractant or even wildlife attractant, is that they would rather it not be in close proximity. So, but they tolerate it, and again, they try to mitigate the hazard that's caused by those agricultural areas. Tourism is another one that could be appropriate in close proximity of airports. Obviously, commercial operations, whether it be a gas station or retail, they're really not impacted by airports much. And matter of fact, there could be some synergistic value in having uses that would be used by pilots and passengers and technicians, mechanics and stuff that would be working at an airport, as well as maybe it's close to a major roadway, and therefore they can sort of attract the transient population or local population to those destinations too.
Okay, the next question is, does the FAA still require states to file airport system plans?
At least some states do. I don't know if I could say that all states do. I mean, with 50 states, and we have not worked in all 50 states to know that. We haven't researched all 50 states to know that, but I don't have a conclusive answer to that.
Okay, so our next question is, you mentioned cases where an airport might encourage certain kinds of land uses, for example, businesses. Would you give some more examples?
Yeah, and again, it's all based on site-specific conditions and site-specific needs, community needs. But when you really start putting your mind to it, there is quite a bit that you can do if you are wanting to create an economic development node. So whether that's technology businesses or businesses that have outdoor storage, fleet vehicle operations, whether they're doing mechanical work on those fleet vehicles or just it's the place where those fleet vehicles are dispatched from. There's just a whole host of industry/employment types of operations that can be compatible. The places that you want to stay away from are those extensions of the runway, because again, if you look at the plots in that Berkeley report, most of them are dead on extensions of the runway. They get thinner as you start spreading away from the center line of the runway. And then they also happen on the airport's facility. So maybe somebody skids off of a runway, or somebody has a failed takeoff and has to put it back down, but it's on the airport's facility. A lot of the risks are mitigated as long as you stay out of the runway centerline extensions, as well as stay off the airport property. Beyond that, it becomes more of a noise issue, and buildings can be soundproofed and mitigated. Hotels, for instance, may be a perfect fit next to the airport, but the local ordinance probably or may want to speak to the sound transmission class that it's in, so that the guests that are staying there are not impacted by the noise. So again, the residential, maybe a movie theater is not the right, although as loud as they have those theaters cranked up, I don't know if you would hear even a jet flying over. But you just have to think logically about, is this a noise-sensitive use? Are they likely to remonstrate? If not, they're probably a pretty good fit. The second factor there, though, another factor really is the density of that development. At some point, could become at least a risk to pilots and passengers, because if you have to put down the aircraft, even if you're in control of the aircraft, if there's not places, open space, where you can point your nose and get there, if it's so fully developed, then that can be a problem as well. So you want to at least keep that in mind when you're allowing land uses close to.
Great. So our next question is, what are some of the factors that determine runway length and orientation?
Well, prevailing winds will determine the orientation of the runway, as well as existing land uses, as well as migratory birds. I mean, there's just a whole host of factors that facility planners and engineers use to make those determinations. But generally speaking, you're going to, if you're at 5,000, 5,200 feet of runway length, you're pretty much a full, an unrestricted airport at that point, a general aviation airport. There are some that are justified, some general aviation airports that are justified and get support from the FAA to get funding to extend them to 7,000, 7,200 feet. But that's pretty rare. And so what you're going to typically find with general aviation airports are runway lengths between 3,200 and 5,400 is going to be your normal range. Obviously, at the lower end of that, it's all about Cessnas and not about corporate jets. When you start getting into the 5,000 range, again, that becomes pretty much an unrestricted airport. You also want to make sure that if you want to be in the commercial aviation industry, is you have to have the precision approach opportunities. Your facilities are going to typically be, or need to be, 450 acres of land. That's going to allow them to have a crosswind runway at some point in the future. Again, we're talking about airports that are going to be commercial in operation and pretty significant operations. We're not talking about the small town one runway types of airports needing 450 acres. But when you look at and you can go on Wikipedia, and they have almost all the airports in sort of a brief description in Wikipedia, and you'll be able to find sort of the acreage that's owned by those airports and the runway lengths, and you'll get a good sense pretty quickly of what the norms are out there. But that's a place to start.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we are just about out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over and give all the attendees who are still listening just a few reminders. Thank you so much, Brad, for the presentation. I think everybody really enjoyed it.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, for those of you who are still in attendance, I just want to go through a few reminders. So let's see. First off, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM and select today's date, which is August the 12th, and then select today's webcast, which is Fights Over Flight, addressing general aviation airports. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are recording today's session, so you will be able to find a recording of this webcast along with a 6-slide per page PDF at www.apa.org/webcast-archive. So this does conclude today's session, and I want to thank everyone again for attending.